So, Tim Byrne, current CAO with IRCA, you've been with the Conservation Authority since?
1984 on contract, 1985 full-time.
And I know you refer to this purple book still to
That's
this
the
day.
Bible.
So tell us a little bit about this Essex Region Conservation Report.
Well, the report actually was completed by the Ministry of Natural Resources, and actually that book and a lot of the work and the information gathered for that book, the people actually were operating out of this building. Russ Powell was with the province at that point in time and put together our original watershed report. The information contained in that document is amazing. It's valid because it's science-based. Obviously, some of the projections and some of the planning that's referred to at that point in time was now become quite dated. But the resource management information in there it's still utilized today because it's accurate and to the point, and it was compiled by a group of students and others, and then peer-reviewed by the province. So it's a great document.
So, Ken, you were hired by the Conservation Authority in 1975, and what was your role at that time?
I started out being a planner.
And so, tell me your perspectives on this purple book.
As Tim said, I think it's a great overview. Yet, it focuses on the key priorities. It touches on most of the conservation areas that should be purchased. It talked about flooding issues. It talked about all of the issues in a great fashion. It was far ahead of its time.
Was this the first time that municipalities had a centralized resource to lean on for advice when it came to planning, protecting against natural hazards and protecting for natural areas?
Absolutely, and again, I credit, throughout this discussion, I will talk about a number of folks that I hope to be able to identify and show gratitude towards. Frank Wansborough was the mayor of the city of Windsor, and Bob Pullyblank was the reeve for Sandwich South. Those two gentlemen, Bob Pullyblank was also the former warden of the county of Essex. Those two gentlemen led the charge and encouraged, I think there were 3 votes actually before the establishment of our Conservation Authority. Those two individuals realized the benefit of a regional resource management agency. I think in significant part probably, it wasn't an environmental rationale. It was Windsor Essex were missing out on a great deal of money. And Bob Pullyblank, I didn't know Frank as well, but Bob Pullyblank understood resources management. He was a landscaper, and he understood some of those fundamental issues from a very practical point of view. So the concept of a watershed, the concept of interrelationships within a natural heritage feature were totally foreign to them. So endless new concepts for them, and most of them were quite challenging for them to understand and accept.
But as Ken is identifying too, at that period in time, we were going through horrific storm events. We were at high lake level period, 72 and 73. St. Patrick's Day flood in 1973, significant, millions of dollars of damage. And at that point in time, in other areas of the province was actually making available funds. And they were making those funds available to conservation authorities. There was not one here. How can we facilitate transfer of some of those funds and what have you? So there were things afoot as well that encouraged the establishment. But as Ken says, it was the transfer of funds and what have you. Your question about an agency dealing with resource management, there wasn't anything like that in this area at all.
And just one more point, if I can make it. Tim alluded to flooding issues, especially in the early 70s. Shoreline flooding was a horrendous problem throughout most of our region. But the other issue that book, which speaks to the rapid rate of disposing or diminishing natural heritage sites. 18% reduction from 1955 to 1972. It was 2.8% is the number that was in that book.
Yep.
And I think Bob Pullyblank, more than anybody, knowing and loving trees, realized that this is a huge problem for the region. Didn't understand all of the watershed implications, but that was another huge issue that everyone recognized.
That's some of the concern lately too, as well, with respect to the changes afoot. Conservation authorities originally created under a conservative government, and in 1946, originally for rampant deforestation and drought. And as we go through time and you develop programs and money comes down through federally and provincially down to us to manage, on a watershed basis, our current government, which is a conservative government, seems to have forgotten when they talk about mandate. The original mandate was for deforestation and drought. Now attempting to focus only on flood and flood response, we will succeed in delivering a message and delivering programming on a watershed basis for this region. And included with that has to be natural resources and natural resources management. Whether it's labeled mandatory or non-mandatory, it's part, you can't separate that or pull that out of ecosystems and ecosystems management. So it's some challenges that we're facing now.
Well, my job was actually to start up a tree planting program for the authority. At that time, they were talking about 3.8% forest cover. And my job was then to head up a tree planting program, go out to landowners and encourage them to plant trees. And that, of course, wouldn't take place until the following year, 76. But that year we planted 33,000 trees. That was our first tree planting. We got a machine, and that's one of the differences to me. I still think of it. To Bob Pullablank, he found out that Holland, in Holland, Michigan, they manufactured a tree planter. So he picked me up, and in his pickup, we drove to Holland, Michigan to buy a tree planter and bring it home. I was there for the first millionth tree. I still remember where it was planted and who planted it. It was John Miner and Fred Cata, and they planted it on the Miner Sanctuary. And the second millionth tree was planted behind the Urca workshop, in that, we're a little bit to the east of it. The third, I don't remember, but I remember the fourth.
So Chris, at some point then, you started for the Conservation Authority in about 1977,
Give
here
or
at
take.
the John R. Park
Yeah.
Homestead.
Yep.
But tell us about, you were just speaking about your early interaction with the Conservation
Well,
Authority.
my first interaction was with, like, seeing staff like Henrik, probably Ken, I'm not sure who else, probably Stan Taylor, coming out to the house to look at the bank, my parents' house, I should say, where the bank, it's called a circular slump. I remember that, and where it just literally, because of the high water, this is the early 70s, ate away the toe of the bank, and down it went because there was not enough weight to hold it up down at the bottom. I don't think that we would have still been here. Our house, my parents' house, which we still own, is right on the edge, the top, very edge of the bank. And if it hadn't been for what the Conservation Authority did, I think quite a few people, not just my mom and dad, would have lost their house. But yeah, that was my first interaction with Urca. But having said that, I went and met Ken and Stan Taylor in the Essex office that was on Main Street when they had the Essex office to do my physics, grade 13, when we still had grade 13, physics project on why that happened. And I thought, that's an interesting organization. Maybe I could work with them too. And I came out here and worked. I mean, I loved what we did with the tree planting program, as Henrik mentioned. And yet, then as we moved on, and there were things like the work that was done here at the homestead, Holiday Beach, all of the conservation areas, like to me, they're all so important. And I think it was at Henrik's retirement where I kind of said, how lucky are we, all of us, to be involved in, for all the ups and downs that we had, and we certainly had, had some, but how lucky we are to know that we did all of that. The other big one, of course, is the Greenway. That's another big one. And we did that, and we've made a difference, and I think we'll persevere even with the current lack of understanding on the part of some people in the province.
On that note, the Greenway, the train station, that is probably the biggest project I have been involved in.
Kingsville train station.
Yes.
Yeah, the Kingsville train station.
We have done collectively, and of course many people that followed after us, and some that are still here, but we have done, we did fantastic work that very few people can say, hey, I actually got to do that.
Oh, I still to this day, when I drive with Marilyn, and said, oops, we planted those trees.
Yes.
Every time.
To have that sort of profound and tangible impact on the environment and in this community that we all still live in and we all still love, I think is, for staff past and present, and I would think board members too, it is really something that we can all be so proud of. And so Patty, you started a little bit after Chris in 1981. And what are some of the memories that you have of that time?
Well, I was hired initially as program manager for the mural project.
That's the big one in the Civic Center.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
Where-
is
is it
now.
up?
The really interesting thing was Mike would not let us leave the property to go look at conservation areas and so on.
Some of it was based on photographs.
Photographs.
Because there's one of tree planting
Yeah.
that exists.
You riding the
Yeah.
driving the tractor in the tree
And
plant.
that is based on a photograph.
Yes, but working with Bev, doing all the handouts and things for the school programs.
Bev Wanick.
And I was excited in learning all the plants and flowers, and we did go into the woods, and we did the wildflower walks and so on. So that part was fantastic, because I loved my time there. It had a huge influence on my life.
I have said proudly often that we were very careful about staff we hired in most cases. All of our staff were good. If they weren't good, they didn't last. And that sounds a little callous, but the rest of the staff deserve that level of that high standard. Stan Taylor was exceptional in so many ways. And he, not only his intellect, his discipline, his diversity, I said at his retirement, there is no other staff person that has done as much in as diverse number of areas as Stan Taylor did. There were some of the extremes because he was so analytical, he was so precise, he was so patient and tolerant, just endless areas that he worked, and he was exceptional. But I again go back to my first comment. Our staff were all exceptional, and I've said that throughout my career. I've said it many times afterwards. They were exceptional. They are what made our conservation authority successful. There are a number of folks outside of the authority, and I've listed them often. People like Herb Gray helped us endlessly. Without Herb Gray's involvement, we wouldn't have the Cipher Systems Greenway property. They wanted cash for it. This is CNCP. I said, we don't have the money. It would be really nice if you donated. They said no. I went to Herb Gray and said, please help me. The next day I got a call, the property was donated. Peter Stroh from Stroh Brewery with respect to our Heritage River designations. Cliff Hatch gave us a farm worth $500,000. Without his encouragement, without his financial contributions, we wouldn't have been able to proceed with the Chrysler Canada Greenway. We just wouldn't have had the political/financial support to do it. The first floodplain mapping that was completed was on the North Shore, all of the municipalities up there. It was just endless problems. They wanted to have some knowledge of floodplain mapping, but they didn't want to have the impacts in terms of restrictions. The floodplain mapping criteria that the province imposed on us was Hurricane Hazel floodplain standard and the typical approach methodology to do the mapping. It resulted in about a third of the north half of the county being restricted from development. Obviously, that was not workable. Obviously, it wasn't practical. But the province simply said, that is the way we do things. You will continue to proceed with that. I had the pleasure of going to municipalities, trying to identify the impact of the mapping from a provincial standard. And there are many times that I have been virtually crucified in my career. That was one of them. And
I don't think there's anything virtual about it. It was an actual crucifixion.
There were some really awful responses, but then we hired Stan. Stan Taylor was asked to look at the methodology, to look at the criteria, to come up with a system that would work in our region. I still remember going to conferences talking about my displeasure with provincial criteria, and once I inadvertently spilled a glass of water on the head table where we were speaking from. It had a tablecloth, and it was a perfect example. This is what happens with water in most cases in our region. It's flat, it soaks in, it doesn't follow a valley, it doesn't have large volumes and large velocities. It's very, very different. And the Hurricane Hazel standard was another issue that we had to battle for a long time. But we were successful with both. And yeah, it was, we were the first conservation authority that did shoreline mapping.
Yes.
Our whole 102 miles of shoreline mapping were completed, and it was a very innovative exercise. I remember M.M. Dillon did the work for us. It was very expensive, and there were endless cost overruns because of the complexities.
That mapping was completed in '76, and the province then implemented shoreline regulations in 1991. But that initial study that was completed here was utilized by the rest of the province for the conservation authorities that had shoreline areas, Lake Huron and Lake Ontario, and the rest along Lake Erie. So there's the shoreline regs that we were the first to do. It's quite significant what Ken is talking about. The provincial standard was, there was 3 storms throughout the province that were used. The Timmins storm, Hurricane Hazel, and...
100.
No, the 1969 storm. We then, you know, and Ken was talking about Stan earlier, and Ken, Stan, and I went on this road trip, taking drainage superintendents, taking other administrators, taking clerks, taking mayors, reeves, wardens, anybody would get out and take them out to certain places and say, look, you know, like, we're trying to get this down to something that's more meaningful, provide appropriate protection level, provide appropriate levels of keeping development out, and then allow the rest of the development to proceed. Hurricane Hazel in many locations would have had floodproofing requirements, you know, exceeding 1 meter in height. So the work that Ken and Stan actually completed, it was the first time in the province that the 100-year was used as a regulatory standard for riverine mapping. The interesting thing is, on the date that we actually received notification, or a couple of days around that date, of the reduction from Hurricane Hazel to the 1 in 100 year or maximum observed, we then had to deal with the Harrow flood in 1989. And it's within days of the notification that we could do the 100 year or maximum observed. Then we got hit with the Harrow flood. Yeah. So it's like, oh my God. Now, so what's this standard going to be? So it's again another one of those moments that there was a significant thing done to aid in development for this region, provide a level of protection, and be practical in an application for a standard that's suitable to this watershed. There was over $60 million worth of damage to the region. Major crossings were washed out, major utility, major infrastructure were destroyed throughout the region. At that point in time, Conservation Authority staff were mobilized. Ken had only just recently taken the reins as the CAO and said, let's go. And water management staff and conservation services staff were mobilized to support the municipality with their responses in dealing with flood response. Surveys were undertaken, surveys were completed to get a grasp of how far it affected us, where it affected us. Levels were surveyed to see, okay, does it make sense to regulate to this level? And those assessments were undertaken. And fortunately, we had practical people at that point in time. We'd just gone through the exercise of, the engineered flood standard from Hazel down to 100-year. And cooler minds looked at what happened and occurred and said, it's just unrealistic to attempt to regulate to that. It surpassed Hurricane Hazel for water level.
Many times.
Many times. The Harrow storm is referred to as a 1 in 750 year event.
Wow.
And so again,
just to put that in context, Hurricane Hazel is 4 inches in 12 or 24 hours.
6 inches in a 24-hour period.
And this was at least double that.
Double that.
And so fast forward to 2017, where we had 2 1 in 100-year floods in less than a year. So how, what, I guess, compare and contrast those two different events?
Well, the events that Tecumseh, Windsor, and some of Lakeshore responded to, again, you start talking how much rain and, how much of a period. The other interesting thing is those events most significantly affected the urban environment. And in the urban environment, you're dealing with storm sewers and storm drains, which are designed to handle a much smaller amount, maybe quicker, but the only way for those rainfall events to get into that infrastructure is through catch basins and surface inlets. So the rainfall that hit Tecumseh, Windsor, and Lakeshore, they were basically 150 millimeter, 6-inch rainfall events in a 12-hour period. But they weren't in saturated conditions. But the unusual set of circumstances was we just got through one rainfall event and then we get hit with another. So we're now dealing with, the impact of climate change and the impact of climate variability. And fortunately, some of the good work that, my predecessors were engaged with and that I've had to follow up with, standards were set that accounted for, some of those unusual types of things where through planning processes we plan for freeboard. We plan for some buffer, not just try to hit some magic number. So, but we are now seeing those unusual events occur more commonly. And don't forget, the 100-year standard is a 1% probability in a given year, not once in a century. So, but they are occurring more commonly. So now we're going to have to adjust these standards to reflect on what we're seeing, but we can't knee-jerk on it. We've got to be as practical as Ken and others were attempting to be in previous decades with, a reasonable standard. We have to stay ahead of it and plan for something that's an appropriate but actual implementable standard. So again, we're fortunate that we have some skilled practitioners in this area, in this region, and some consultants now that are been around as long as I have, and some that actually are being utilized at the provincial level to do this type of modeling. That's like landmark engineering.
So one of the areas that I think the public most loves about the Conservation Authority are the conservation areas that we manage. In the early days of the Conservation Authority, there was a lot of establishment of conservation lands going. So Ken, I imagine you were involved in some of that. Our first conservation area, Maidstone, was bought for $44,000.
Don't you wish you could have bought a
Yeah.
whole pile
so
back
tell
then?
us about sort of those early days of establishing conservation areas and some of the processes that had to be gone through, and how did we get the money to buy up those lands?
As it was called at the time, Maidstone Township Central Conservation Area, silly name, politically determined. The other one was Devonwood, and both of those were purchased very quickly in order to take advantage again of the newly found provincial funding that was used to match municipal dollars. Planning conservation areas was interesting because we didn't have any. We had no experience, and none of us on staff had done that. Fortunately, my personality was such that I would drive around the province and stop at every conservation area, to the dismay of my good wife Anita and our daughters when they came along. But we learned quickly what others were doing. We hired a landscape architect, Jerry Bolan, who was a very creative individual, and we designed public access, roadways, parking lots, trails, and we did the reforestation that Henrik was referring to. And the whole concept of reforestation brings up, again, issues of standards that existed prior to us and things that were just not applicable, and making the changes. The Ministry of Natural Resources gave us money, thought that they knew something about planting trees, and they said, you will plant white pine and
Black walnut.
green ash.
Oh yeah, but
And you will plant plantations. You will plant monoculture white pine, monoculture green ash. And I said, but that's not what nature does. And we're not going to use this for harvesting purposes. We're going to do this for natural habitat, nature appreciation, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a huge battle with the ministry just to convince them that we should plant native species to replicate what might have been here originally. So conservation areas, the whole process, again, the province had their bureaucratic procedures. We had to produce master plans that would be approved by them, and that process was also cumbersome. We became much more practical over time. And anyway, those were our first two conservation areas. They're great conservation areas.
1950s, 1960s, Ag and Food gave away significant grants to farmers to remove hedgerows and trees. And so that period is Ken identified in the Purple Book. 1955 to 1972, 18% of the tree cover in this region was destroyed and removed. Provincial money was put forward to assist with that. Well, then as we evolved and as the tree planting program evolved, and the province started putting money back in, because it was understood we need to have tree cover. We need to have, or we're not going to sustain ourselves in this watershed. And, we're sourcing and looking for, financial supports to assist with delivering that program, which is a significant undertaking, as you're hearing from Henrik and Chris, their description of the equipment that's required, the human power that's required to be engaged with it, the administrative overhead that's required to actually make it successful. It doesn't just happen.
When we're looking at climate change, one of the absolute, if you're looking at some of the things they're talking about to mitigate it, one of the easiest and best things we can do is plant a tree. They take in the carbon dioxide and they
store the carbon.
Yeah, store the carbon and give us oxygen. What a very nice exchange, right?
What I would talk about, though, that was impactful, most impactful situation was when Mike Harris, the Conservative government at the time, cut Conservation Authority budgets by 70%. How do conservation authorities respond? Many conservation authorities thought about closing their offices, selling their conservation lands. I remember that experience being most influential in terms of our future. Essentially, there were a few options. We could close We could diminish our size massively. We could foolishly ask municipalities if they would cover the difference, which they wouldn't do. They wanted to cut comparably to what the province was cutting. Or we could simply become more entrepreneurial, focusing on our foundation, which we did, focusing on fee for service for all of the services that we provided that did have a fee for them. And the other part of that was with the 70% cut, all of those restrictions that were imposed on us by the province were eliminated. We were free to do what we wanted, to do what the local region wanted us to do or required of us to do. We became very independent, and that to me was one of the most freeing, mind-expanding opportunities that we experienced. It caused us to understand, caused me to understand, maybe foolishly, that we can do almost anything if we try to find the solution. And we did in many, many cases thereafter. You know, the Chrysler Canada Greenway is an example. Heritage River in Detroit River was an example. There are endless examples, but that singular event was most impactful, I think, for many of us as staff, for me in particular, but also for our future.
Patty, how about for you?
I worked for John Olmsted for about 20 years, off and on, and he was really into conservation farming, and I was able to, through my knowledge, do graphics on it, write articles about it, encourage him. You know, I felt like quite an expert in comparison just because of learning about it at IRCA, and it was a big selling point for him for a while when he was in the vegetable business.
Chris, how about for you? What stands out as one of the Conservation Authority's biggest accomplishments?
Well, really hard, because I did participate both in tree planting and then the conservation areas. And I was trying to think what made the biggest impact for the public. And I think when I think of, like, so it was a toss-up, tree planting program in general, and then the Greenway. And the Greenway, which of course is now expanded a lot, was way more public. Tree planting, I think, definitely less public, but extremely also beneficial. So I've narrowed it down, I think, the tree planting program. The fact that, I would love to know if there is a number that we have now of where we stand.
Natural areas
Yeah.
coverage total is 8.5% now.
And
where we
that,
started.
yeah, and we all know that was made possible. And, it wasn't just like tree planting happened on its own, of course. It was a real big group effort. And the fact that members supported it, and even after, and still are now. So, yeah, I would say, I guess for me, that would be the big impactful one. But there are many more.
There are lots. It's hard to narrow it down to
Yeah.
one. Henrik, how about for you?
Well, I'm partial. It has to be tree planting because I was so intimately involved with it, started the program. And personally, for me, the train station, Kingsville train station, was probably my, if I can say so, crowning achievement. I spent 2 years there, and I think the results
It's
speak for
gorgeous.
themselves.
It's gorgeous.
We went to, took extraordinary steps to try and do it as authentic as possible.
From paint samples on that ugly green
Yeah,
framing
yeah.
of the windows to everything. Yes,
Yeah,
it was amazing.
Like
project.
the wainscoting, we had somebody come in, he had a special tool to measure the profile of it. And then it was manufactured in London.
And John Olmsted has said that, well, first of all, we, the Conservation Authority, have, I think, done, other than maybe Willisted, the two best restorations of publicly accessible buildings in the region. The Kingsville train station, John Olmsted keeps saying, it was the a very influential beginning of all of the glorious restaurants that currently exist in
I
Kingsville.
agree with that.
Yeah.
Southeast Leamington. It was difficult, and there's still significant unfinished things that are required to be done there. But it was something as an agency we responsibly had to act on. And it was unpopular, it was hateful, it was all of those things. It was very divisive. But we had a responsibility to come forward and say, we have to try and protect you despite yourselves. We still to this date have unresolved matters there, but we have many matters that are actually coming around now, and there appears to be some federal supports for some significant undertakings with respect to mitigating some of the habitat issues and some of the flood protection issues, especially around Hillman Marsh. But some of the other issues are still there, and the challenge still faces us. But again, it is our responsibility, and we have to do that. I've got a couple of other things too. I wish to say, like this beautiful vista that we're looking at right now. Rebecca Belanger and myself, I personally was on the team that fought McGuinty wanting to put wind turbines out here. And we went up to the province and actually looked for assistance with archaeological, heritage, and everything else that we could use. Otherwise, there'd be windmills up in this area of Lake Erie. The final thing, and it's the process that we are embarking on end of this year, and that is to come back to our member municipalities and with the assistance of many others, such as Caldwell's and many others, to say this work that we do is important. This work that we do has to be sustainable. So whether you want to label it as mandatory, non-mandatory, or what it is, we have to have levy supports and or contribution agreements for non-mandatory funding. We will succeed with that. And by end of this year, 2024, we have to have those agreements in place for the budget cycle coming up for us next year. So that will be a significant issue. It's like what Ken had to deal with the cuts from Harris. So, you know, we will approach the board.
I look around here, Al Ray. It was a pure joy to work with that man and how particular he was. Dennis Chase,
Yes.
for example. I've never worked with a guy that was as easygoing, no problems, anything. When you sent Dennis out, you didn't have to worry. It would be done one way or the other, maybe not the way I want to do it, but the end result would have been the same. He never came home and not having
Never
finished.
complained.
And never, and always in a good mood.
Exceptionally kind
Yeah,
human being.
yeah, and I've done enforcement work with him, and he had an uncanny ability to de-escalate a situation. Where Tim and I would be in a fight, he would.
Which happened a few times.
Yeah, but
Which happened a
he
few
was
times.
best buddies with and the result, the situation had been solved. We did it one way, Dennis did it another, and he was a pure joy to work with and a very good friend.
There are just so many bits and pieces of people that I've carried with me since leaving the authority. Henrik, for example, you know, I mean, we started out, he was my supervisor, and then the roles reversed. Yet, always, always, always full respect, full, you know, support, cooperation, and if he didn't like something, he told me, you know, vice versa. And that, you know,
It
like...
was a good relationship.
Yeah, like it worked. Yeah. And that's one example. You know, Dennis was another example. And the thing is, I could go down, right on down, like with Patty, with Tim, with Ken. We just had, you know, some real long things that have affected me for the rest of my life with each individual. You know, some of the things that I learned from you, watching you, and you know, how you dealt with stuff, for example, is another one.
I've had the pleasure of serving the longest. Yeah, I beat you,
Rub
Ken.
it in.
Ken gave me that opportunity. Ken hired me. And I learned a lot from him, watching him administrate, direct the traffic. Once I, was hired, then I had the pleasure of working with Henrik very closely. There's a point of, and you ask about special moments and certain things, and it's not a big thing that would, others may not celebrate, but we are the second conservation authority in the province to gain special constable status. And Henrik and I were on the squad of personnel that had that. And that designation came with a lot of pride for me. I remember the day we were in front of the justice.
Oh, she was a judge.
A judge. And she, and we took our oath. And, it's just a point of pride in that. But there's been so many, like Ken mentioned Herb Gray before. We were also the first conservation authority in the province to sign an agreement with Department of Fisheries and Oceans to deal with their approvals at the local level. And Herb Gray and Ken, I think a lot more Ken than Herb. Herb just thought it was a good idea, but Ken forced it to happen, sheer will. We signed that agreement before Toronto, before anybody else in the province had that. And then our way of dealing with that work was then used as a model by the province for the others to follow. So we were trailblazers in many cases, and then we established, some leadership, but, there's other people. Cynthia Casagrande retired. Cynthia was with us for 30 years. And she was a woman that took on a job of dealing with contractors and the like that many others would have shied away from, but she served that post for 30 years, and with a lot of aplomb. She was recognized provincially for her work. So Patty, I can recall Patty, when Patty was working with us, I had the opportunity and pleasure of socializing at many occasions with Patty, and as Chris said, Chris and I sang together.
Yeah.
In a church choir. So there was relationships that you built with the people who you worked with, but it was more than just a job. And so those, that type of a kindred spirituality that happens and whatever else, it is one of our strengths.
We are Urquoids.
Yeah, we're Urquoids.
I think it's great. Somebody I mentioned that I was going to do this, and they said 50 years. It seems like such a short time, and so much has been accomplished. We've grown, we've changed. I think there's a lot of potential. I don't envy Tim these days, going through the same battle again with the province. But we've gone through enough that I hope Tim and staff/board members and municipalities have grown and learned and realized the importance of continuing. So I'm optimistic, I'm happy, I'm proud. Last comment, I could not have imagined ever in my life having a profession where I would have been given the opportunities to be productive, responsibly productive, but also the opportunities to have fun with so many great people, to extreme, always to extreme.
Henrik, how about you? Final thoughts on our 50th year of conservation.
I'm proud of what we have done and what they have accomplished since, both with Ken, Richard, and now Tim, and I hope it'll continue.
Chris?
I would say, yeah, there are challenges now, but like Tim said way back at the start of this, I think it was, everything that purple or brownish report was based in science and watersheds. And I have a real belief that eventually, as the pendulum goes, it always goes back to what is really based in science. And the fact that what I saw from landowners, all of the staff who went beyond this being a job. Everybody really believed in what we did then, and I'm sure it's the same with the staff now. So there are going to be challenges. It will even out. It will work out. It always does, because that's the right thing. And when you have people like Ken said, who we had so many people who just believed so much in what they're doing, and I'm sure it's the same way. There's a lot that can be done still, and I can see the Conservation Authority going for easily another 50 years.
The staff seem all younger now, though.
Yeah, they are, for some reason.
When you go up there,
yeah.
it's like going into a high school prom.
We probably look that way.
Patty, how about you?
Well, I have high hopes for the next 50 years. I think people are more aware of what they're eating, what they're breathing, materials they use for things, and I'm very proud to have been a small part of it. And once an ergoid, always an ergoid. I still, I see when I run into any of this, it was such a big part of my life and something I still believe strongly in. But I'm hoping that the relationship with the Caldwells or other, I was in Prince Edward Island last year this time, and the native people there, their signs are first in conservation areas, then English, then French. And that they believe in the land, everything that IRCA believes in. I think the Caldwells or other tribes can help guide the way as well.
Excellent. And Tim, we'll wrap up with you. 50 years
Well,
of conservation.
I'm amazed. I'm amazed that it's here so soon. My tenure here does not seem to be as long as it has been. There's been ups and downs. There's been good and bad, and I think that's normal in our lives, and I think it's needed in our lives. But my time is short, and I need to prepare myself to hand off to the successor. And I think that whoever is fortunate enough to take this helm, will take over with an organization that actually is grounded in the fact that it associates direct with the people of this watershed and this region. And as long as you do that, you will succeed.